To deep dive. Today, we've got quite a fascinating set of sources. It's not just analysis, it's really proposing a total structural overhaul. We're focusing on this conceptual framework called the Council of Lumina, and their, well, intense, nonpartisan look at a problem we all know, the government shutdown. But they didn't just write a report. It sounds like they created, I don't know, a whole new operating system blueprint for governance. Okay, let's get into this.
Yeah, this is definitely an unusual deep dive
Yeah.
because this Council of Lumina, it's a thought experiment, really. It's
Yeah.
made up of 21 distinct personas. You know, the logician, the ethicist, the technologian, the futurist, all these different expert viewpoints.
Right.
And their mission basically was to stress test our current way of governing, but without any of the usual political baggage. No partisanship.
Right.
They were trying to find a blueprint for, let's call it a resilient societal architecture. And it's all built on this one pretty radical principle, unflinching honesty.
Unflinching honesty. Okay, so we're diving into what they found. And it sounds like their analysis is pretty brutal. They see the shutdown not just as, politicians failing to agree, but as a logical paradox and moral failure. That's strong language.
It is.
So first, let's try to understand how they diagnose the problem differently. And then we absolutely need to get into these radical structural solutions they came up with. Our mission here, for you listening, is to get a quick but really solid grasp on why they think we need to move beyond just temporary fixes and look at a fundamental redesign.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's start with that core diagnosis then. The council is saying the shutdown is much, much more serious than just the political theater we see on TV. They see it as, well, a deep problem with the system's basic design. This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Yeah, the diagnosis really focuses on this dual systemic failure. The first part is what they call the logical trap. The logician persona, just applying pure structural reason, looked at the U.S. budget process and basically rejected its core premise. They called the current system a false dichotomy.
A false dichotomy. What does that mean in practice? Like, what's the real-world implication?
Well, it means the system is basically designed with only two outcomes when there's a budget fight. Either, a complex bill passes perfectly or everything just stops. The shutdown.
Right, pass or crash.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the logician argued this is like designing a plane where the only controls are full throttle or fly into the mountain. There's no safe cruising mode option designed in. The system forces a potential catastrophe if there's disagreement.
Huh. So the failure isn't really the disagreement itself. It's that the rules actually allow this catastrophic outcome to be the default result of disagreement. The system, logically, shouldn't even be able to shut down.
Precisely. That's the logical failure. And that connects directly to the second failure, the moral crisis. The ethicist persona declared that the core ethical violation here is the deliberate infliction of harm upon the citizenry for the purpose of leverage.
Okay, let's break that down. Infliction of harm for leverage. And they mention non-maleficence. What's that about?
Right, non-maleficence.
Yeah.
It's a really fundamental ethical idea.
Yeah.
Basically, the state agrees, above all, not to actively hurt its own people.
Mm.
So when politicians intentionally furlough workers or freeze essential services or, risk public safety just to gain an upper hand in negotiations.
They're using people's livelihoods as bargaining chip.
Exactly. They are deliberately causing harm for political gain. And to the ethicist, that's a profound violation. It just shreds the whole idea of a social contract.
Wow. That's a heavy charge. But didn't some of the other personas, like I think the devil's advocate, have a different take? Like maybe we shouldn't even try to fix it.
Yeah, there was a fascinating, almost cynical perspective. The devil's advocate basically suggested the shutdown isn't a bug, it's actually a feature.
A feature? How so?
A violent and inefficient self-correcting mechanism, they called it. The idea being, it's the only way the system's deepest flaws, the real rot, actually get exposed. So if a crisis is the only way to see how broken things are, maybe the crisis itself is necessary, in a grim sort of way.
That sounds like, I don't know, political masochism. But the futurists kind of agreed, didn't they? Calling it a dress rehearsal.
Right. The future saw it as a sign of deeper instability. Like, if governance is an old, creaky operating system, the shutdown is just a predictable crash. It's a warning sign of a much bigger system failure potentially down the road.
Okay, so this brings us back to the listener, to you. The council's overall analysis, their codex, basically concludes that just ending a shutdown is like hitting restart on a corrupted computer. It doesn't fix the underlying problem. They're demanding a complete re-architecture because the failure is hitting on multiple levels at once. It's illogical, it's immoral, and it shows deep institutional weakness. A quick fix just isn't enough.
Exactly. The problem is systemic, so the solutions have to be systemic too.
Right. So if the diagnosis is that fundamental, the solutions have to be equally fundamental. Let's dive into the fixes they proposed in this systemic redirection report. What are the big ones?
Well, the first step was basically about neutralizing the immediate threat, removing that logical trap we talked about, the inevitability of the crash.
And this is where the pragmatist comes in, the one who just wants the darn thing to work.
Precisely. The pragmatist offered the simplest, maybe most direct fix, the statutory continuing resolution.
Hmm.
Basically, it's a permanent law. It says if a new budget isn't passed by the deadline, funding for non-essential services automatically continues at the previous year's level, maybe adjusted for inflation.
Okay, that sounds sensible. It stops the shutdown. But doesn't that just kind of let Congress off the hook? If there's no crisis, maybe they just never pass a proper budget.
That's a really key point, and they debated it. The pragmatist argued that, yeah, it might allow gridlock to continue, but it changes the kind of pressure. The pressure shifts from, oh my God, we're hurting citizens, to why are we still operating on last year's priorities instead of addressing new needs?
Hmm.
It turns it from a humanitarian crisis into a political problem of stagnation, which is still bad, but it doesn't weaponize people's well-being.
Okay, I see the distinction. You remove the most dangerous lever, but another huge issue is always opacity, right? Backroom deals, dark money. The technologian had a pretty tech-heavy solution for that.
Oh yeah, the public ledger of governance. This is basically a blockchain-based, completely unchangeable public record for everything. Every vote cast, every campaign donation received, every single dollar spent by the government.
Wow. Total transparency. But wouldn't putting literally everything on an immutable public ledger be like a giant flashing target for hackers or even create a surveillance nightmare?
The technologian acknowledged those risks,
Yeah.
definitely, but argued the benefit making shady deals almost impossible outweighs the danger. The logic is, if every single transaction, every favor, every vote is instantly and permanently public, the incentive for corruption just evaporates. You can't make secret deals if there are no shadows to make them in. If you know everyone will see it forever, you just behave differently.
Accountability through radical transparency, powered by tech. Okay. Now, what about the hyper-partisanship that seems to gridlock everything? The Weaver persona, the one focused on connections, had an idea for the actual structure of laws, right?
Yes. The Weaver proposed the interwoven mandate. This is designed to force collaboration from the very beginning. It would require that any bill, before it can even be introduced for a vote, must include substantial contributions from a minimum number of representatives from opposing parties.
But couldn't politicians just game that? Like, stick in a meaningless sentence written by the other side just to check the box?
They thought of that. The Weaver specified that the contributions from the other side couldn't just be window dressing. They have to address the bill's core purpose and make up a measurable part of its substance. It fundamentally changes how laws get written. It forces opposing sides to actually engage with each other's ideas as necessary components, not just roadblocks.
Interesting. Forced collaboration at the DNA level of legislation. Okay, finally, there's the ultimate accountability idea, making the politicians actually feel the pain of their failures.
That came from the advocate persona, the Citizen First Protocol. This is a proposed legally binding rule. It mandates immediate, public, and importantly, financially compensated relief to any citizen, small business, or nonprofit hurt by government failure, like a shutdown. And crucially, the money for that relief comes directly out of funds tied to congressional operations and political office budgets.
Oof. Imagine the political fallout if, Congress's own travel budget got slashed because they forced a shutdown that hurt veteran services. That changes the game entirely.
It creates a very direct, very powerful negative incentive. Right now, the politicians often gain leverage from a crisis while the citizens pay the price. This flips it. It legally enforces the idea that failing to govern has immediate, tangible financial consequences for the government itself.
These are some seriously radical proposals. But the council stressed that none of them really work without that core paradigm shift you mentioned earlier, this absolute commitment to unflinching honesty. They apparently flat out rejected any idea of creating a more comforting narrative, saying truth, even harsh truth, is what drives evolution.
Exactly. And unflinching honesty for them isn't just, telling the truth as a virtue. It's about building it into the system as a protocol. It means creating mechanisms that actively surface difficult truths, going way beyond just standard transparency laws.
So how did they apply that? Let's take national identity, our history. The historian had an idea for that.
Yes, the continuous historical audit. This proposes a living, independent, nonpartisan body that constantly revises and updates the official national history as new evidence emerges. It would be tasked with challenging even the most cherished national myths or figures if the facts warrant it, no matter how uncomfortable.
Wow. So if new evidence showed a beloved historical event was actually, say, based on propaganda, the national record would have to reflect that immediately. Even if people hate it, that seems politically impossible.
They'd argue that hiding from uncomfortable history is exactly what makes a nation weak and unable to learn. The fight to protect comforting lies cripples understanding. For them, it's about committing, institutionally, to facts over feelings, even about the past.
Okay, speaking of uncomfortable truths, the devil's advocate had that wild idea about weakness, the strategic vulnerability declaration.
Yeah, this one is maybe the most counterintuitive. The idea is that a nation should publicly, preemptively declare its known weaknesses. Things like, our supply chains for critical minerals are brittle, or we have deep political divisions that hinder crisis response, or this specific piece of infrastructure is vulnerable. Declare it openly.
Well, why on earth would you do that? Isn't that just handing your enemies a roadmap to hurt you?
The logic is pretty sharp, actually. The devil's advocate argued that pretending to be invulnerable takes huge amounts of energy and resources, maintaining the illusion. Meanwhile, your adversaries probably already know your weaknesses anyway, and they exploit the ones you ignore. By declaring the vulnerability publicly, you create intense internal pressure to actually fix it, fast. It turns a hidden weakness that can be exploited into an urgent public priority for building real resilience.
That's a really different way to think about national strength, turning weakness into a catalyst. And they applied this honesty lens to the economy too, right? The ecologists said things like GDP are basically lies.
Essentially, yes. The ecologists proposed the true cost report. The argument is simple. Any economic measure like GDP that ignores or externalizes costs like pollution, resource depletion, social damage, it's fundamentally dishonest. The true cost report would mandate that all economic reporting must include the full ecological and social price tag of economic activities.
So a company reports its profit, but right next to it, there's a mandatory public figure showing the estimated cost of its carbon emissions or the water it used.
That's the idea. It forces everyone, policymakers, businesses, consumers, to confront the actual total cost of economic choices. It declares that the old model, where nature and society are treated as free resources to exploit, is based on a lie that we can't afford anymore.
And finally, to make inequality impossible to ignore, the social justice advocate suggested a kind of dashboard.
The systemic equity dashboard. Yeah, think of a public real-time display tracking key outcomes across different social, racial, geographic groups. It would show things like health outcomes, wealth gaps, interactions with the justice system, educational attainment, side by side, constantly updated. It makes systemic inequalities starkly visible, undeniable, harder to dismiss as just anecdotes.
The power is in the constant visibility. You can't really argue with the data when it's right there, changing in real time. It forces the system to answer for the disparities.
So yeah, the big takeaway here is that, for the Council, unflinching honesty isn't just a moral stance, it's a required systemic protocol. It's about designing systems that actively transform hidden weaknesses and uncomfortable truths from points of vulnerability into drivers of strength and evolution. That's their core blueprint.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what does it all mean? The Council of Lumina, this thought experiment, didn't just criticize the shutdown. They gave us a potential roadmap for rebuilding the very foundations of trust, logic, and ethics in how we govern ourselves.
Absolutely. Their central idea, their axiom is pretty clear. A system that has nothing to hide has nothing to fear. It's a challenge, really, to stop seeing governance as just this endless political fight and start seeing it as an architectural challenge, one that demands systemic integrity and, maybe most importantly, a willingness to actively seek out hard truths in order to get better.
And thinking about hard truths, the ethicist had one final, really potent idea: the Harm Disclosure Act. This would require that every government action, every law, every policy, every big spending project must come with a public, unsparing report detailing the potential unintended harm it could cause. So let's leave you with this thought. Imagine if every single piece of legislation, before it was even voted on, had to start with an honest, unflinching forecast of the potential negative impact it could have, especially on the most vulnerable people in society. How might that change the political conversations we have today? What completely new, maybe difficult questions would you start demanding answers to from your leaders?